That's Daniel Hopsicker, the Florida-based reporter who penned the moniker and has written extensively about Cocaine One. He seems to think that Fernando Blenchio Cesena is hiding something, or hiding a lot of things. Blenchio, as we've heard, claims to be the man behind the DC-9 with 5+ tons of cocaine that got busted in Campeche on April 10, 2006. In his first round of recorded interviews with reporter Menyo Larios, Blenchio insisted that he had purchased the DC-9 and that the previous owners, Fred Geffen and Royal Sons Inc., had committed a major error by not immediately canceling the plane's registration. Here's what he told Menyo.
Ellos no cancelaron la matrícula. Un error de esos pendejos no cancelar la matrícula. Pero el error es costoso porque el mundo no se lo cree, ¿me entiendes? Para efectos prácticos, el avión estaba volando con una matrícula y bajo la propiedad de Royal Sun.
It was their mistake, he says, and a grave one, because the plane was flying as if it still belonged to its U.S. owners, and no one will believe them when they say that they had already sold it. Blenchio claims that he had nothing to do with Geffen and Royal Sons. He claims that Jorge Corrales, whom he describes as the business partner in his legal companies, coordinated the purchase of the DC-9 without any knowledge of Blenchio's plans for the plane. Hopsicker, however, just doesn't buy it.
But Jorge Corrales is an airplane broker, and that plane, when it was busted, was owned by Frederick Geffen, who, if you read the Venezuelan document, had been busted by the DEA and rolled over and was working for them ever since, which makes perfect sense to me.
Although, actually, Blenchio does mention the CIA, though very briefly. Here's what he told Menyo.
Eso puede abundar sus papeles de que los aviones están vinculados directamente con la CIA, de que el avión estuvo en Guantánamo, de que el avión estuvo en París con la CIA, de que el avión sí hacía vuelos para la CIA, el avión mío, ¿sí?
Which means, I can send you those documents that the planes really were connected to the CIA, that the plane was in Guantanamo, that the plane was in Paris with the CIA, that the plane, my plane, really made flights for the CIA. Blenchio never sent those documents, but he told Menyo that the DEA sent an agent to Guadalajara on April 11, the day after the drug bust. That agent interviewed local airport authorities, whom Blenchio says were on his payroll. Those authorities, confronted with the evidence from the Falcon 20, also confiscated in Campeche, told the DEA agent that Raul Jimenez Alfaro was the owner of the plane and that Raul Jimenez Alfaro was Fernando Blenchio Cesena. From that moment, Blenchio says, the DEA spent 2 years confiscating businesses, properties, and bank accounts belonging to Fernando Blenchio Cesena and Raul Jimenez Alfaro. But the DEA never charged Blenchio or Raul with any crimes related to the DC-9, not even when they realized that they had arrested him, or rather both of them, in the Dominican Republic, by mistake, and perhaps illegally. The plane shows up on a runway at a small coastal airport in Mexico, stuffed with coke. The Mexican army says that irregular flight behavior raised suspicions, and that the plane and the blow belonged to El Chapo Guzman. The Venezuelan government investigates the plane and produces witnesses who say the plane was empty as it was being repaired on the runway in Caracas. Fred Geffen says he sold the plane through a broker and does not know the identity of the purchaser. Jorge Corrales says that Geffen does know who the purchaser was, though he declines to name him to reporters. And Fernando Blenchio Cesena, who was also Raul Jimenez Alfaro, and Luis Alberto Ortega Sandoval, and Jorge Alberto Amarillo Serrano, and Luis Fernando Bertolucci Castillo, says that the plane and half of the coke were his, and that the other half belonged to his Colombian partner. Blenchio also says that he loaded the plane there in Venezuela before the first of the 2 doomed takeoff attempts. And he says that he never had anything to do with Geffen and Royal Sons Inc., and that, by the way, the plane used to make CIA flights to Guantanamo. And you know what? I think they all lie. They mix pieces of truth with bits of lies and try to tell a captivating story, an exciting story, a useful story for moving whatever it is they're trying to move. What we can gather from all these stories, however, is that a single airplane loaded with cocaine brings together the DEA, the CIA, the Mexican Army, the Venezuelan National Guard, and Fernando Blenquio Cesena, a mid-level pilot and air logistics manager for illegal drug corporations, with some 30 years of experience under his belt, now serving time in the US for things he didn't even do. My name, for now, is John Gibler, and this, like Jacob Homer, is Transportista. Episode 10, In a Sense. When Fernando Blenquio Cesena reached out to Detective, he promised a story that would be better than the Zapatista rebellion of January 1, 1994, and the murder of presidential candidate Luis Donaldo Colosio nearly 3 months later. Here again is how Menyo Larios described Blenquio's first getting in touch with Diego Osorno and Detective, pitching them his life story.
First, it was like really mysterious guy because he only gave me a phone number and he told me, you gotta call this guy. He's supposed to be in jail. He's been telling me that he has a great story to tell us that is better than a documentary that we just released like a couple months earlier in Netflix. This guy started like I don't know if harassing is the right name. He was looking for Diego and he was like really anxious to talk to him. So Diego Osorno gave me the assignment, and so I called him.
When I read through the transcripts of Blenquio's interviews with Menyo, I noticed that Blenquio mentioned a few other reporters with whom he had been in contact. I decided to call them up and ask them about their experiences speaking with and their impressions of Blenquio. The first reporter I called agreed only to speak to me off the record. The second reporter I called was Gerardo Reyes, a remarkable Colombian investigative journalist, the director of Univision's investigative unit, and the author of many books, including, most recently, Alex Saab, The Truth About the Businessman Who Became a Multimillionaire, Nicolás Maduro's Shadow. In episode 2 of this podcast, I mentioned that when I first reached out to Reyes in early 2021, he was surprised to hear that I was working on a story about Blenquio. Reyes told me that Blenquio had long promised him the exclusive rights to his story, that he would tell Reyes all that he had done and all that he knew for a book or a film that would blow people's minds. Reyes said that while he was still hoping for the promised permission to materialize, he had not been in touch with Blenquio recently. As we heard in episode 2, Reyes was getting ready to release a television segment using interviews with Blenquio in 2017, when Blenquio sent him a strange letter. Here again is what Reyes told me.
So when we were preparing a special program about El Chapo Guzman, I convinced Blenquio to go on the record. My idea was recording him from jail and using his voice over with a video and image as the people from the Making a Murder documentary did greatly. He was very helpful. He not only described Guzman in his different stage of his life, and basically he explained how the Air Force of the Sinaloa cartel operates, the procedures to land a small plane in a clandestine track of the Sierra Madre, the international routes of the drug trade, and how they refuel the planes on air. He explained that step by step. But days before we were going to air the program, Blenquio stepped back, and he said that he would not authorize the interview. He sent a letter in legal terms, arguing that the revelation of his statements will put him and his family in risk, or something like that. Despite that I have his authorization on the record, I decided not to use the interview. Then I learned that he has been in contact with several reporters offering his life story.
letter in legal terms that Reyes mentions is an affidavit that Blanquio wrote, signed, had notarized, and filed in his own court case in November 2017. The affidavit summarizes Blanquio's correspondence with Reyes and then forbids Reyes from using any of the material from those interviews. The document, written after Blanquio gave Reyes his authorization, as far as I can see, has no legal standing whatsoever. If two people sign a contract, one person alone cannot rescind or change the terms of that contract. When two parties establish an initial agreement, both parties must similarly establish any alterations to that agreement. Pretty basic, right? Thus, filing an affidavit about his interviews with the journalist in his drug trafficking court case, in which he pleaded guilty and then unsuccessfully tried to alter his plea, seems to me to be a kind of legaloid trick designed to intimidate reporters. Reyes says that he had Blanquio's authorization on the record, but decided not to use the interview, and that he was thus surprised when I reached out to him and said that Blanquio had been telling his life story to Detective. When I accessed Blanquio's court case, I found another affidavit filed in January 2018, and this time naming Daniel Hopsicker. Hopsicker told me he didn't even know that this affidavit existed. It seems that Blanquio filed the affidavit after speaking with Hopsicker in person. Blanquio had reached out to Hopsicker and invited him to visit him and talk in prison, just as he had done with Reyes. When I first called Hopsicker, I didn't know that he'd been to meet Blanquio in prison. Here's how he described that meeting to me.
I guess you wanted to talk a little bit about Fernando, who I went up to see 3-4 years ago. Nobody even knew. Okay, I mean, I had been writing about the bust of the DC-9 with 5.5 tons of cocaine, and he was arrested, extradited to the U.S., convicted at trial, and sent to prison, all before anyone. And you could see I probably did a couple hundred stories about it, without anyone knowing, without anyone knowing that he had been involved with 5.5 tons of cocaine, which is pretty amazing. But it's the way things go. It's the way things go here in the States. He wouldn't. He talked, but he wouldn't talk. I mean, it was like he would like legally. He was attempting to market what he knew to prosecutors in the El Chapo case, and I don't know if he was successful or not because I got disgusted. I don't know if he's still in prison or not.
The godforsaken prison in North Carolina that Hopsicker mentions is the Rivers Correctional Institution, from which Blanquio spoke with Manuel on a smuggled-in cell phone. The 2016 Department of Justice report had this to say about the place.
Rivers had the highest rates of contraband fines, excluding cell phones, inmate assaults on staff, uses of force, guilty findings on inmate discipline cases, inmate grievances, positive drug tests, inmate on inmate sexual misconduct, and the lowest phone monitoring rate.
Godforsaken indeed. Blanquio apparently was moved to another prison in Georgia during the pandemic. I told Hopsicker that Blanquio was still in prison, though he seems to have been moved, and asked him if he could tell me a bit more about what impression Blanquio made on him when they met.
I felt sorry for him when I met him. By the time I left, I didn't. The people are imprisoned in the United States in conditions that should be an international scandal. It wasn't as if he had things any harder than anybody else there, but it was only it was like a medium lockup, but it just looked stultifying, and he had been there 3-4 years already, and he had solicited me to come see him, and so I schlepped all the way up there, a day and a half drive up there. And he had decided, he would talk just a little bit because he was trying to retell his story to the prosecutors in the Chapo case. He worked for Chapo. So I got disgusted. He didn't want to tell the truth. He wanted to sell the truth.
Hopsicker's appraisal here finds some support in the court documents. U.S. attorneys initially presented Blenquio as a star cooperating witness before cutting ties with him and accusing him of trying to sell his testimony. Blenquio says that U.S. attorneys lie. He told Menyo that the U.S. attorneys told him not to include any information in his testimony about acts of violence carried out against him and his family by another drug trafficker who was also collaborating with the DEA. Such evidence would tarnish that person's standing as a reputable witness in other cases, Blenquio says that the U.S. attorneys told him. I wouldn't be surprised if both the DEA and Blenquio's accusations against each other were actually true, or true in part. Regardless, the idea of a man marketing the truth resonates with me here. What I've heard in how Blenquio tells his stories, and in the experiences of the reporters who've spoken with him, gives me the impression of a mid-level executive in a global illegal industry, an industry that depends upon the constant production of official invisibility, and thus on the marketing of stories told with facts and lies. An executive who, upon being stripped of his airplanes and bank accounts and multiple passports and taken off to prison, turns to the only resource he has left to try and keep his business afloat. A man who, after decades of ups and downs flying cocaine all over the world, finds himself behind bars and becomes a trafficker of his own story. As Hopsicker says, a man who does not want to tell the truth, but to sell the truth. Over the 10-plus years he has been in prison serving a 13-year sentence, he has sought out and spoken with several reporters, and then filed legaloid documents attempting to forbid those reporters from publishing anything he told them. The affidavits naming Gerardo Reyes and Daniel Hopsicker are not the only ones in his file. And all these affidavits, in a glorious twist of irony, are signed by one Luis Fernando Bertolucci Castillo, a man arrested by the DEA in the Dominican Republic, taken to Miami, and sentenced for drug trafficking crimes he had not yet committed. A man who, in a sense, does not even exist. Transportista is a Detective production with Exile Content Studio in partnership with iHeartRadio's My Cultura podcast network. Directed and narrated by John Gibler. Transportista's voice by Joaquin Cosillo. Editing and sound design by Fernando de la Rosa and Pedro G. Garcia. Reporting by John Gibler and Menyo Larios. Produced by Julio Gonzalez. Voice recording by Hugo Merino and Rene Garcia. Transportista's interviews translated by Carla Ruiz Argaiz. Production supervision by Nando Vila and Álvaro Céspedes. Associate producers Alonso Aguilar and Alejandro Duran. Diego Enrique Osorno is the creator and executive producer along with Daniel Eilenberg and Isaac Lee. Executive producers for iHeartMedia are Connell Byrne and Giselle Bunces. For more podcasts from iHeart, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.